Before the 1800s, there were only two different classes of low-pitch instruments, woodwind and brass. Brass tended to have a loud and powerful sound which was not matched by any other instrument of the time, making it highly desirable for large parties and other loud events. The problem with this was that sound was very monotonous, and although this group of instruments produced a very nice sound, they tended to become boring without the sounds of other instruments intermixed. The woodwinds were exactly the opposite. These tended to be quieter instruments that were used primarily in classical applications. They mixed quite nicely with the brass, but were generally overpowered by both noise from the brass and the noise that the audience produced if there was a large event going on. It was March 20th, 1846 that an instrument that would be able to bring these two classes of instruments together was invented. This instrument, known as the saxophone, pioneered the way for bands of the future.
It took me almost 8 years to fully develop the saxophone as we know it today. It progressed through many stages, each stage changing the shape, size, and various parts of the instrument until the sound I wanted was just right. Although I did most of the work, the instrument had many other crucial developers, as well as Hector Berlizia, one of the greatest composers of all time, and a very dear friend of mine provided a starting ground for the instrument. Not only did Hector publish the new instrument in the famous Journal des Débats of Paris, he also featured my instrument for the first time in one of his concerts.
Looking back, it was no surprise that Adolphe Sax was able to create such an impressive and popular instrument out of almost nothing. Born on November 6, 1814, Sax's father was an expert maker of musical instruments, which was a tedious and demanding job that required attention to detail and extreme focus considering the very few production machines of this day. Sax's father had a great influence on him. As a child, he learned to make instruments in his father's shop. By the age of 6, Sax had become an expert on both building and playing all different types of musical instruments, from the most common mundane instruments to exotic and rare instruments that were from faraway countries.
I learned to play multiple instruments, both during my youth and later on in my life. Much of the learning I did was due to the testing I did for the various instruments my father made. Although I knew how to play many different instruments, my primary instruments were the clarinet and the flute, which I learned to play at Brussels Conservatory at my home in Belgium.
Unsurprisingly, the saxophone began to rapidly take off after its invention in 1846. After it was featured in Hector Berlioz's various concerts, demand for the saxophone and saxophone players began to grow rapidly. The turn of the century brought about new musical styles and different, more upbeat music, such as in the many war marches written around this time due to World War I. The saxophone became a common instrument in the French infantry bands and was later imported to America by John Philip Sousa, a well-known composer who wrote many of World War I's military marches such as U.S. Field Artillery and El Capitan, a march played in class earlier this year. The saxophone, to me, is one of the most important instruments of all time, not only in its sound, but in the culture that goes along with it. The saxophone, unlike any other instrument in history, brought about the pick-up and play philosophy. Flautists, violinists, pianists, violists, and other musicians that played in organized classical bands had to go through many years of practice and private lessons before they were seen fit to be in these bands, no matter how good they started out. The saxophone is an instrument that you can just pick up and play. As long as you are good, you can play professionally, private lessons and years of practice or not. After World War I, dress became more liberal. Flappers who wore short skirts and got drunk in public became a common sight, and America's taste in music changed once again, only this time the saxophone was seen as the defining instrument of the period. The saxophone cultivated modern-day musical methods such as improvisation. Players such as Sidney Bechet, a soprano sax player who pioneered the voice-like tone of the saxophone in jazz, and Johnny Hodges, an alto saxophonist who developed the jazzy wailing tone that is almost inseparable from the saxophone, showed that without the saxophone there would be no jazz, no big band, and little else besides classical music. From the jazz age to now, the saxophone has been one of the most basic elements of modern-day bands. It rose from being an instrument that was an odd mixture of brass and woodwind that was simply a novelty to one of the most important musical instruments of the current day.